Have you ever stopped to think if a country's highest court, the final word on the law, can ever just turn around and say, you know what, we messed up? It's a fascinating question, right? Well, today we're jumping into the incredible story of how Singapore's Court of Appeal did exactly that. They gave themselves the power to change their own mind, and it completely reshaped their legal world. And really, this is the big question at the heart of our story. It creates this classic legal tug-of-war. On one side, you need the law to be stable, to be predictable. On the other, you have the absolute need for justice, especially when you realize a past mistake was made or society has just completely changed. All right, so to really get why this was such a huge deal for Singapore, we've got to rewind the clock to before 1994. Back then, the courts were kind of stuck, bound by this long, powerful chain of legal history. Now, this idea is called judicial precedent, or stare decisis if you want to get technical. It's basically the foundation of common law systems. Think of it like a baker following a recipe that's been perfected over generations. It gives you consistency, right? You know what you're going to get. It makes the law stable and predictable, which is super important. But what happens when that recipe is just plain wrong, or just doesn't work anymore? And that was exactly the problem Singapore was facing. Before 1994, their top court wasn't just bound by its own past decisions. It was also tied to rulings from the UK's Privy Council, a direct link back to its colonial days. For a young, independent, and rapidly modernizing country, this was like trying to run a marathon with your shoes tied together. The law just couldn't keep up with the new reality of Singapore. So this brings us to the main event. The solution was this thing called the 1994 Practice Statement. And trust me, it was way more than just a dry legal document. It was basically a declaration of legal independence for the entire country. And you've got to look at the timing here, because it tells you everything. In April 1994, Singapore completely severs its final legal ties to the UK. Then, just 3 months later, boom, the Court of Appeal issues this statement. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a powerful signal to the world that from now on, Singapore's legal destiny was in its own hands. And the statement itself is crystal clear about its purpose. It really boils down to 2 key missions. Number 1, stop injustice. If following an old ruling leads to an unfair result, or not doing it. And number 2, let the law breathe. Let it grow and adapt to fit the unique needs and circumstances of Singapore. No more being stuck in the past. Now, when you get a brand new power like this, you don't just go wild with it. The court was actually pretty careful at first. They started by focusing on fixing really obvious errors, especially in criminal cases where the stakes were incredibly high. We're talking about people's freedom. In this case, Abdul Nasir is a perfect example of the immediate impact. For years, there was this practice where a life sentence was just treated as being 20 years. But when the court took a hard look at it, they realized, wait a minute, there's no actual law that says that. It was just a convention. So they overturned it and declared that from now on, life imprisonment means exactly what it sounds like, for the rest of your natural life. That is a massive change. You can almost hear the judges wrestling with the issue in this quote. It captures their thinking perfectly. They're saying, look, we know the law needs to be certain and predictable, but we have to weigh that against the very real injustice that happens if we just keep following a decision that we know is wrong. It was all about finding that right balance. So, after a few years of carefully fixing these clear mistakes, you start to see a shift. The court's confidence grows. They begin to see the practice statement as more than just a repair kit for the law. They see it as a blueprint for actually building a modern, truly Singaporean body of law. You can really see this evolution in 2 main stages. They started out being reactive, finding problems and fixing them. But then they became proactive, asking a much bigger question. How can we shape the law to build the future we want for our country? And the Express Print case just shows this perfectly. The old rule, which dated all the way back to 1895, basically said that if you own land, your neighbor only has to make sure your empty land doesn't collapse. Any buildings you put on it, that's your problem. Now, think about that rule in a super dense vertical city like modern Singapore. It's totally absurd. So the court just said, nope, this is obsolete, and created a new rule for a new reality. The right of support includes buildings too. And then you get to a monster case like Spandeck. I mean, here the court didn't just tweak a rule. They essentially took the entire messy area of negligence law, threw out decades of complicated precedents, and replaced it all with one single, streamlined modern test. That's not just fixing the law, that's rewriting the playbook. And this brings us to the court's most mature phase. This is where they showed they weren't just willing to overturn old decisions, but they were even willing to revisit and debate their own very recent rulings. It shows you that they see the law not as a set of stone tablets, but as a living, breathing conversation. Just look at this legal back and forth over what it means to be an accomplice to a crime. For decades, there was a really strict test. Then, in 2008, the court says, let's try a broader one. But just 2 years later, a new set of judges looks at it again and says, you know what, we think the old, stricter test was actually better. This kind of public debate and refinement shows incredible confidence. So what does all this add up to? What's the real legacy of this one statement from 1994? Well, it's nothing less than the story of how a national court transformed itself into a respected leader on the world stage. And here's the most important thing to remember. The practice statement itself didn't magically change anything. It was a tool. The source article calls it an implement. The real story, the real impact, came from the judges who picked up that tool and used it with courage, skill, and a deep understanding of where their country was headed. And you don't have to take my word for it. Legal scholars who've studied this say that this journey is what helped Singapore's Court of Appeal become, arguably, the leading common law court in all of Asia. That's an incredible journey, and it all started with giving themselves permission to admit they might have been wrong. And that really leaves us with this big final thought. Singapore found its answer to this puzzle. But this fundamental tension between having stable, predictable rules and the never-ending search for what is truly just, that's a challenge that every single legal system and every society has to face. It's a conversation that never, ever ends.